When I saw that headline about Germany dropping a World Cup bombshell and FIFA supposedly panicking, I had the same reaction many of you probably did. Another sports controversy, another dramatic clash of personalities, another round of outrage that will burn hot for a week and then disappear. But I want to slow this down with you because when a country like Germany makes a move that rattles FIFA, we are not just talking about football, we are talking about money, power, labor, and a global business model that depends on everyone playing along quietly. And when someone stops playing along, even partially, the panic tells you a lot about how the system really works. What officially happened, in simple terms, is that German football authorities and political leaders signaled that they were no longer willing to accept certain conditions tied to future World Cups. That could mean financial guarantees, public subsidies, legal exemptions, or political constraints that FIFA has come to expect as the price of doing business. FIFA, for decades now, has operated like a supranational corporation. It arrives in a country, demands special treatment, and usually gets it. Tax breaks, public spending on stadiums and infrastructure, relaxed labor and procurement rules, and a kind of hands off political posture while the tournament is underway. Most governments agree because the World Cup is sold as prestige, growth, tourism, and national pride rolled into one. Germany's move matters because Germany is not a small or desperate football nation. It is wealthy, central to European football, and deeply embedded in FIFA's legitimacy. When Germany says, even implicitly, we are not sure this deal makes sense anymore, it exposes something fundamental. The glossy surface story is about sport and values. The deeper story is about who pays, who benefits, and who carries the risk when mega events are organized under capitalist rules. To understand why FIFA would panic, you have to understand its economic position. FIFA does not build stadiums. It does not permanently employ the construction workers, cleaners, security staff, or transport workers who make the tournament function. Those costs are pushed onto host countries and their taxpayers. FIFA, meanwhile, controls the brand, the broadcasting rights, the sponsorship deals, and the global revenue streams. It socializes costs and privatizes gains. If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because it is a classic pattern in modern capitalism. Germany, like many countries, has lived through decades of austerity debates, infrastructure strain, housing shortages, and pressure on public budgets. When you are a worker, a tenant, or a small business owner, you feel those pressures directly. Schools need repairs, public transport needs investment, hospitals are understaffed. Against that backdrop, it becomes harder to justify pouring billions into a month-long spectacle whose economic benefits are, at best, unevenly distributed. You may love football, but love does not pay rent or fix a bridge. There is also a political dimension here that we cannot ignore. FIFA prefers predictable partners. It prefers governments that will not ask too many questions about transparency, labor standards, environmental impact, or democratic oversight. Germany's political culture, for all its contradictions, includes strong unions, vocal civil society, and a public that increasingly questions corporate privilege. That creates friction, and friction in a system built on smooth extraction of value feels like a crisis. I want you to notice something important. FIFA's panic is not about morality alone. It is not simply about values or symbolism, it is about precedent. If Germany can say no, or even say maybe not on these terms, then others might follow. Smaller countries might look at their balance sheets and ask why they are subsidizing a global organization flush with cash. Workers might ask why they are rushed, underpaid, or excluded from decision making for an event that generates enormous profits elsewhere. Taxpayers might ask why their money is guaranteed while FIFA's revenue is protected. This is where sport becomes a mirror of the broader economy you live in. Corporations frame their demands as inevitable as the cost of participation in a global system. Governments often accept that framing because they fear being left out, but every once in a while, someone hesitates, and that hesitation reveals how much of this system relies not on law or necessity, but on consent. As we go deeper into this story, I want you to keep asking yourself a simple question. If an institution truly creates shared prosperity, why does it react so strongly when asked to share risk, cost, and accountability? That question does not just apply to FIFA. It applies to the economic system you and I navigate every day. To see how we got here, we have to zoom out and look at the long buildup that made this moment possible. FIFA did not always operate with this level of confidence and entitlement. Over time, as television revenues exploded and sponsorship deals turned football into a global advertising platform, the organization's power grew faster than the public's ability to hold it accountable. Each successful World Cup reinforced the same lesson for FIFA's leadership. Governments will compete with one another to host, and that competition can be used to extract more concessions. If you think about it, this is very similar to how corporations play cities and countries against each other for tax breaks or subsidies, promising jobs and growth in exchange for public money and political flexibility. Germany has been on both sides of this story. It has benefited enormously from football as an industry, with strong domestic leagues, global brands, and profitable clubs. At the same time, it has seen firsthand how mega events distort priorities. Stadiums built or renovated for a single tournament can become expensive burdens afterward. Local communities are displaced or disrupted. Public funds are locked into long-term commitments while private partners capture short-term gains. For many years, these costs were downplayed or dismissed as the price of global relevance. What has changed is not just Germany's attitude, but the broader economic mood. Across Europe and beyond, people are questioning why public resources are so readily available for corporate projects, but so scarce for social needs. You feel this when your commute gets worse, when childcare costs rise, when public services are trimmed while executives announce record profits. In that context, the World Cup starts to look less like a celebration and more like a case study in how power operates. Let me explain the mechanics a bit more concretely. When FIFA awards a World Cup, it typically requires host countries to guarantee that stadiums will be ready on time, regardless of cost overruns. It demands security arrangements, transport upgrades, and exclusive commercial zones. Local laws are sometimes adjusted to protect sponsors or control protest. If something goes wrong, the public sector absorbs the shock. If everything goes right, FIFA's revenues from broadcasting and sponsorship are largely insulated. This asymmetry is not an accident. It is designed into the system. Germany's hesitation disrupts that design. By signaling limits, it introduces uncertainty where FIFA prefers certainty. And uncertainty is dangerous for any organization whose business model depends on predictable extraction of value. This is why the reaction feels disproportionate. It is not about one bid or one tournament. It is about maintaining a structure where the balance of power remains firmly tilted upward. We also have to talk about labor, because behind every World Cup are millions of hours of work. Construction workers, service staff, logistics crews, media technicians. In many past tournaments, Labor conditions have been a source of controversy and harm. Germany's labor standards and union strength make it harder to cut corners quietly. That raises costs. From a humane perspective, that is a good thing. From a profit maximizing perspective, it is a problem. Again, the tension is structural, not personal. If you are watching this and wondering why any of this matters to you, if you are not a football fan, think about how often you are told that there is no money for the things you need. Then notice how quickly money appears when a powerful institution demands it. The World Cup is just a very visible version of a much more common pattern. Capital makes demands, the state absorbs risk, and ordinary people are told to be grateful for whatever trickles down. Germany's move forces that pattern into the open. It invites a public conversation that FIFA has long preferred to avoid. And once that conversation starts, it is hard to contain because the questions it raises are not really about football at all. They are about who decides how collective resources are used and in whose interest. At this point, it is important to talk about the key actors involved and how responsibility is distributed, because one of the most effective tricks in these situations is to blur accountability. FIFA presents itself as a neutral guardian of the game, above politics and economics. National governments present themselves as hosts acting in the national interest. Local officials talk about opportunity and pride. But when you line these roles up, you start to see how carefully risk and reward are separated. FIFA's leadership is responsible for setting the rules of the hosting process. Those rules reflect choices. They prioritize revenue stability, brand control, and commercial exclusivity. None of that happens automatically. These are decisions made by people responding to incentives inside a highly commercialized organization. At the same time, national governments decide whether to accept those rules. They weigh political costs against perceived benefits. For years, saying yes was the default because saying no felt unthinkable. Germany complicates that picture because it introduces political friction where compliance was expected. German football authorities have to answer to fans, clubs, and players. Politicians have to answer to voters who are increasingly skeptical of elite deals made behind closed doors. When they hesitate, even modestly, it exposes how much of FIFA's authority depends on deference rather than force. Now, I want to be careful here. This is not about accusing individuals of bad faith without evidence. It is about recognizing institutional behavior. Organizations behave according to the incentives built into them. FIFA's incentive is to maximize revenue and minimize uncertainty. Government's incentives are mixed, pulled between public accountability and elite prestige. When those incentives align, everything looks smooth. When they clash, we suddenly hear about panic and crisis. The wider consequences of this moment are potentially significant. If Germany's stance encourages other countries to rethink the costs of hosting, FIFA may have to adapt. That could mean sharing more risk, accepting stricter labor and transparency standards, or reducing demands on host nations. None of that is guaranteed. Powerful institutions rarely change willingly, but pressure accumulates, especially when legitimacy is at stake. For you as a viewer, this matters because legitimacy is a fragile thing. Once people start to see that a system is unfair, they question not just one deal, but the whole arrangement. You may have seen this dynamic in your own workplace. A company pushes too far, cuts too much, or demands too much unpaid flexibility. At first, people grumble quietly. Then someone speaks up. Suddenly, what was normal becomes controversial. There is also an international dimension here. FIFA has increasingly turned to countries with fewer democratic constraints, where public dissent can be managed and guarantees can be enforced with less debate. Germany's reluctance highlights that contrast. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether global spectacles are being steered away from places where citizens have a real say. That should concern anyone who cares about democracy, even in something as seemingly apolitical as sport. The human impact of these decisions is often lost in the abstract language of bids and hosting rights. But real people are affected. Construction workers face deadlines and pressure. Residents deal with displacement or rising rents. Small businesses are promised booms that may or may not materialize. When costs overrun, it is public budgets that absorb the shock, not FIFA's balance sheet. What this case reveals at a deeper level is a familiar structural problem. Capital prefers mobility and flexibility. It wants to move events, factories, or investments to wherever conditions are most favorable. Communities, on the other hand, are rooted. They cannot pack up and leave when a deal turns sour. Germany's move is a reminder that rooted institutions can still push back, but only if they choose to. As we continue, I want you to think about how often you are told that these arrangements are inevitable, and then ask yourself who benefits from that story and who is asked to pay the price when inevitability turns into obligation. When we reflect on this situation at the system level, it becomes clear that the conflict between Germany and FIFA is not an anomaly. It is a concentrated example of how capitalism organizes power across borders. Large institutions accumulate leverage by making themselves indispensable. The World Cup is framed as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a global honor, something you cannot afford to miss. That framing narrows political imagination. It pushes governments to think in terms of competition rather than cooperation, to ask, how do we win this bid rather than does this actually serve the public? This is where historical perspective helps. If you look back, mega events were once justified as tools for development, national cohesion, and shared celebration. Over time, as commercialization intensified, the balance shifted. The event became the product, and host countries became part of the supply chain. Their role was to deliver infrastructure, security, and political stability on demand. The profits flowed upward, while the risks stayed local. That pattern mirrors what many of you experience at work, where decisions made far away shape your daily reality, but your voice in those decisions is minimal. Germany's resistance, limited as it may be, disrupts the narrative that there is no alternative. It suggests that even within a capitalist framework, there are choices. Governments can demand more transparency. They can insist on stronger labor protections. They can question whether public subsidies are justified. None of this abolishes capitalism, but it does challenge the most extreme forms of corporate privilege. Of course, there are trade-offs. If FIFA responds by favoring more compliant hosts, Germany could lose out on future tournaments. Jobs tied to those events might go elsewhere. Fans might feel disappointed. These are real considerations, and it is important not to romanticize resistance. Structural change often comes with costs, especially in the short term. The question is whether those costs are borne fairly and whether the long-term benefits justify them. This brings us back to the human side of the story. For workers, the difference between a World Cup organized under pressure and one organized with accountability is not abstract. It affects wages, safety, hours, and voice. For communities, it affects housing, public space, and local budgets. When decisions are rushed to meet external demands, those human impacts are treated as collateral. When there is time in democratic debate, they can be addressed, even if imperfectly. I also want to acknowledge the emotional pull of football itself. Sport matters to people. It creates identity, joy, and connection. Critiquing the political economy of the World Cup is not the same as dismissing that love. In fact, many fans want the game to be organized in a way that reflects the values they associate with it. Fair play on the pitch loses meaning if exploitation off the pitch is normalized. What we are seeing now is a tension between two visions of global sport. One treats it primarily as a revenue generating machine, optimized for sponsors and broadcasters. The other treats it as a social institution embedded in communities and public life. Germany's move brings that tension into focus. It forces FIFA and all of us to confront which vision is actually guiding decisions. As you listen to this, you might be thinking about parallels beyond sport. Maybe it reminds you of a factory threatening to relocate unless wages are cut, or a tech company demanding subsidies in exchange for jobs. The logic is the same. Mobility is used as leverage, fear of loss disciplines resistance. The question is always whether collective action and political will can rebalance that relationship. This moment does not resolve those questions, but it sharpens them. And once questions like these are clearly posed, they tend to spread. They move from football to other arenas of economic life. They encourage people to ask why certain arrangements are treated as natural and who has the power to redefine them. As this debate unfolds, it also forces us to think about democracy itself and how it functions under economic pressure. Decisions about hosting mega events are often made by a small circle of officials, consultants, and corporate partners. The broader public is presented with a finished package and told to get on board. When Germany signals hesitation, it opens a small but meaningful space for public deliberation. That is not a revolutionary act, but it is a democratic one. It says that consent matters, even when the stakes are high and the spotlight is global. For FIFA, that kind of deliberation is inconvenient. Public debate introduces unpredictability. It raises questions about distribution, accountability, and long-term impact. From the perspective of an organization accustomed to clear guarantees, debate feels like risk. But from the perspective of citizens, debate is how you protect yourself from deals that look good on paper and disappoint in reality. I want to return for a moment to the idea of panic, because panic tells us something important. Institutions panic when their assumptions are challenged. FIFA's assumption has been that the World Cup is so valuable that governments will bend over backward to secure it. Germany's move suggests that this assumption may no longer hold universally. Even a crack in that certainty can have cascading effects. Sponsors worry, broadcasters ask questions, internal politics become more tense. This is where pressure can build for reform, but only if people stay engaged. FIFA has weathered scandals before. It knows how to wait out outrage. Structural change requires sustained attention, not just headlines. That is why it matters that viewers like you understand the underlying economics, not just the surface drama. Think again about how this connects to your own life. How often are you told that a decision is non-negotiable, that the market demands it, that there is no alternative? And how often does that claim fall apart when someone with enough leverage pushes back? Germany has leverage. Many workers and communities do not. That asymmetry is at the heart of our economic system. At the same time, this moment reminds us that leverage is not purely economic. It is also political and cultural. Germany's role in global football gives it symbolic weight. When it questions FIFA's terms, it legitimizes doubt elsewhere. It tells others that skepticism is not fringe or irresponsible, but reasonable. None of this guarantees a better outcome. FIFA may adapt in ways that preserve its core power. Host countries may continue to shoulder disproportionate costs. But the conversation has shifted, and shifts in conversation are often the first step toward shifts in structure. As we approach the end of this reflection, I want you to sit with a few unresolved questions. What would a World Cup look like if costs and benefits were shared more fairly? What would it mean for workers, for communities, for fans? And why is it that asking these questions still feels radical when they are really about basic fairness? These questions do not belong only to football. They belong to any system where concentrated power meets collective resources. The World Cup just makes the dynamics visible because the scale is so large and the spectacle so bright. But once you see it here, you may start seeing it everywhere. And that is where I want to leave you, not with a neat conclusion, but with an invitation to think more deeply about what moments like this reveal. Germany's move does not topple FIFA. It does not suddenly transform global sport into a cooperative democratic enterprise. What it does is puncture the myth that these arrangements are untouchable. It shows that even powerful institutions depend on consent, credibility, and cooperation, not just contracts and money. When you look at your own society, your own workplace, your own community, you can see the same dynamics at play. Power concentrates, justifies itself as efficient or inevitable, and resists scrutiny. Pushback is framed as unrealistic or dangerous, and yet history is full of examples where systems changed precisely because people questioned what they were told could not be questioned. Football fans often talk about the spirit of the game, about fairness, teamwork, and shared effort. Those values resonate because they speak to something real in human experience. The contradiction we are living with is that the institutions governing the game often operate according to very different values. Profit maximization, risk offloading, and control take precedence. That gap between values and practice is not unique to sport. It is one of the defining tensions of capitalism itself. So when you hear about FIFA panicking, do not get distracted by the drama alone. Ask what kind of panic it is. Is it the panic of an organization worried about fans, or the panic of an organization worried about precedent? Is it fear of losing moral authority or fear of losing bargaining power? Those distinctions matter because they tell you where change is most likely to come from. If you found this analysis useful, take a moment to support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Not because it changes an algorithm, but because staying engaged and thinking critically together is one small way we push back against the idea that power should operate without explanation.